Virginia, or Southwest Virginia as we often refer to it. And we'll talk about some findings and recommendations from the assessment and some future directions, and particularly how some of the work from the assessment is informing this newly formed group called the Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network that Kelli will introduce in a little bit. But this presentation, or the assessment, is kind of captured in this document that was recently released in March. And it's at once an assessment, kind of saying, you know, here are some assets and synergies and things like that, but we kind of are viewing it as a launching point, as much a seed as it is a harvest. So one of the things I think that's important to think about, or to frame our work, is the question of why we would do an assessment like this. And the idea of community food assessments, or community food security assessments, have been around for a little while. And I think there's a document by Barbara Cohen from USDA in 2002 that talks about these kinds of assessments, as well as one from the Community Food Security Coalition in 1997, that are they're fairly large tomes on the idea of these assessments. And at that point, they were focusing kind of on these local assessments. And I think that in 2012, when we started this, I think that we realized that food systems work was in a really different place than it was in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we saw a need for doing more of a regional assessment. And I mean, it was partly fed by the fact that this was written into the USDA grant that Nikki mentioned that is a regional, it's a 3-state effort. And so that also informed that. But similar to that, I think that we still had several similar kind of guiding reasons for assessing. I think one was to develop strategic plans for having a food system that's more resilient and food secure. And I also think that the process of assessment, I think you'll see this throughout our presentation, was a space for dialogue and for having conversations about these issues in Southwest Virginia. So I'm going to talk briefly about who kind of worked on the assessment, and I'm going to pass it over to Tim, who's going to talk about some methodology. So like I was saying, this was written into the USDA grant that was funded in 2011, and that we are in the process of wrapping up now. And so the Appalachian Foodshed Project, which is that grant-funded project, kind of initially started it and started this conversation about an assessment. But then it was quickly more of a team effort with some of our community partners, and you can see a listing of them here. So we have, like Kelli here represents Montgomery County in Virginia Cooperative Extension. She's been a key player in this. Jerry Moles, who is also on the webinar, represents Grayson Landcare. And you have several other nonprofits, including AARP, and then you have Virginia Tech. And there are other partners that were involved as well, but kind of as it really progressed, these groups kind of rose to the surface and took on some big pieces. And then emerging alongside this has been Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network, which again, Kelli's going to talk about more later. But it's really become kind of this vehicle for driving forward what's coming out of this assessment. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kim.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Kim Niewolny, and I want to speak briefly about what our community food security assessment process looked like, as well as how we performed it. As Phil has already indicated, we had many different stakeholders involved in this work, and it did stretch across the region. And I think that was really probably what set the tone to how the work got done, because it took place across the region in many different locations. So I just want to be really, I want to set that tone. We had a lot of planning conversations for the first few years, honestly. It was, and that took on a life of its own. There were, and that included groups and organizations and individuals who have both been in the region and also some who have left. And so I think it's really important to note that has its own history, the own conversations of what this process should look like and what could it look like given the interest of the communities and the stakeholders involved. And so that's a really, to me, I think a pretty significant points to the story. And it wasn't just about, well, it was about understanding what community food security was, but that also means understanding what does our food system look like. So there was a lot of learning taking place from the partnerships to understand who's working together and how we work together, but then understanding these really core ideas about food security in Southwest Virginia, and even challenging ourselves about the issues that inform food security, but also notions around what some people are referring to as household versus community food security, and underlining issues of food justice in that food security work. So, as we all probably are very familiar with this work, it's a pretty rich area, but it's also one that's very complicated. So that takes us to our planning stages. This took place over the last 3 years, and the planning was iterative, and it included the many stakeholders that you saw. But in terms of moving forward with some analytical frame to the work, we decided as a team that interviews were a very important place to begin to understand as a developmental process who's going to do the work and who's doing the work, and how should we learn from that conversation to move into more in-depth conversations with our stakeholders. I will talk a little more about that in just a second here, as well as the 3 community work sessions that were held, and I know Jerry and Kelly will talk more depth about their involvement in leadership in that work, and of course the quote analysis and the reporting, which I know Phil will speak to in more depth. So just to note, the interviews that were performed were done very early on, and they were phone interviews across the region. Susan Clark here at Virginia Tech worked closely with, I know, Kelly and Christy Gabbard and Garland Mason were part of that team who performed the interviews. And this was decided by the team to really get a sense of what are the top-tier issues that people are facing around when they hear community food security. What does it mean, and how can we address that better? So it was, again, a developmental process for us, and that helped us understand a better notion of what the desire was to better work together, and which has been a theme throughout this entire Appalachian Foodshed Project, but clearly in Southwest Virginia, a notion to work in more connected relationships with one another, and community networking and collaboration were clearly the top themes, which then pushed us to move forward to talk about how do we learn better to work together? How do we better connect our assets together and to address a very complicated issue? So the teams, this is probably a lot longer conversation than I have time for, but we do encourage you to go to the report to learn more about the approach. But the team decided, well, the team decided to create a more active approach to learning about the work that's being done in the region, and then how can we take those assets, build upon them, and be more strategic and more collaborative as we move forward. I like to call this a very in-depth asset-based community development project. And the community work sessions were titled as such because they weren't listening, they were active. They were community work sessions. And this was reflective of a community-university partnership. You see the groups here. We had one session held in the BlueRidge Plateau, and Jerry will speak more about that. We had another session in the New River Valley Plus, which included other geographical connections, and Kelly will speak more to that. We also had one down in far Southwest Virginia with many stakeholders from Tennessee, which was led by Appalachian Sustainable Development. Myself and Phil and Garland Mason, who represented Virginia Tech, were able to work with each of the community session groups and help move that work forward, and I'll speak to that in just a second. What I want to say here is just to recognize that all this work, we had shared objectives, and we had a shared sense of why we wanted to do this work. These are the questions we were asking each other and asking the communities. But it was really important to recognize that each of the community groups had very distinct goals, very distinct ideas on how they wanted to work with their stakeholders. And so that meant we had unique community sessions. So the designs were different, but we had a common sense of objectives, which I thought was the essence of the work. So I think that worked out really well. And as I conclude here, the sessions were really over a year planning with the different groups. We clearly planned their objectives. This is all IRB approved, all the community work session agendas and how we would collect the information. We audio recorded the entire sessions, and we also had notes that were taken by a facilitator as well as internal notes that we were taking. Those were used in the analysis, which Phil will speak to more, and more importantly, we were using that to both learn and to reflect upon what we kept hearing throughout the last few years, as well as what we heard at those sessions, and then put that into a report that we use as hopefully more a living document to move us forward.
So we're going to kind of transition to hearing from a couple of those community work sessions. Kelli Scott's going to talk about the one that she helped put on, and then Jerry Moles is going to talk about his.
Okay, thanks, Phil. This is Kelli Scott, again, Montgomery County Cooperative Extension, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that active approach that Kim just described with the community work sessions. Again, my area that I was representing was the New River Valley Plus, which was about a 6-county area, and we invited folks to the community work sessions that represented nonprofits, farmers, school districts, folks from the Foodshed Project. Really, it was an open invitation that was more drilled down on from the key informant interviews when we learned from folks there. And we hosted our session in Draper, Virginia in April of 2015. And our big takeaways from that meeting were, A, what are you excited about? And B, what are your challenges related to community food security or local community and regional food systems type of work? And it was really a great opportunity for us to strengthen relationships and begin to learn more of what are our assets in this sub-region of Southwest Virginia and what are some of our challenges. A lot of those challenges we can't solve overnight, but we can begin to erode at some of the difficulties and break down some of those barriers. And again, as Kim said, all of this information was collected and captured to use in the Virginia part of the Community Food Security Assessment. In the New River Valley Plus, we found that we wanted to continue this conversation. Yes, the Appalachian Foodshed Project was hosting this assessment work, but we didn't want to lose that momentum. So after our initial meeting in April, we followed up with a meeting in November of 2015, and we actually have another meeting next week. So the conversation continues.
Thanks, Kelli. Jerry.
Hi, I'm Jerry Moles, and I represent Grayson Landcare. I also sit on the board of Sustain Floyd. We exist in 3 counties along the highest plateau in the state of Virginia. We have adopted the approach developed in Australia called Landcare. We pursue the triple bottom line. We're interested in financial security for everyone. We want to work together to meet shared needs. We want to live in a place that has a healthy, sustainable environment. And in our planning for our get-together to talk about agriculture along the BlueRidge Plateau, we had 2 objectives. We have a concern that as laws and regulations are created in Washington or created in Richmond in our case, these have to fit everywhere. But in a sense, given the complexity of the earth, they really fit nowhere. And looking at how the operations have gone in Australia, what they have done is set aside money and invited local people to identify their needs, their concerns, and what they have to need to move forward in fulfilling the triple bottom line. So what we did in organizing our meeting for March 31st of last year is we invited power to come listen to the local people. We had farmers speak, we had county administrators speak, we had local entrepreneurs and local businesses that deal directly with agriculture in terms of putting together packaging for supermarkets, transportation, and also working with cooperative extension and private extension agencies that help put things together. And so as we sat there, we had members of congressional offices. We had members from the General Assembly, which is our state legislature in Virginia. We had county governments. We had bureaucrats from USDA, the local offices, people from the Virginia Department of Agriculture. The Richmond office of the Virginia Department of Agriculture was represented. And what we did was say, this is how we think and we feel about agriculture in these 3 counties in the highlands of Virginia. As part of this process, we also got the farmers and everyone else engaged in agriculture. So not only are we reaching out to people who influence agriculture beyond our boundaries, but we started to improve upon the conversation across 3 counties about how we can better cooperate. And so since that time, we've gone through a series of meetings talking about, in particular, infrastructure. What is it we don't have and we need to start thinking through agriculture in a different way? One of the things that came up immediately because of the new USDA food safety regulations is, in many cases, to get the kind of expertise we need, we have to fly people in from California. We have to pay them from the time they step on the plane until they step off. And so we're exploring now creating similar businesses to the one in California to create one here in southwest Virginia. So food safety becomes the first thing. The second is a lot of our land isn't managed to the fullest extent it can for the best benefit to the local people and also to enter into the marketplace. We realize that we're within 500 miles of 50% of the U.S. population. We set on interstate highways, and so we want to start participating more fully. We have a farmer's market here who processes food directly from farms year-round, from as far south as North Florida, as far west as the coast, as far north is West Virginia. So the farmers bring it here, it's packaged and sent forward. So food safety is the first thing, and farm management and marketing is second. We need a slaughter facility. So USDA has supported the planning, and we're in process of raising money so that we can start to direct market our meats to markets in New York. Recently, we had a person from Chefs Collective in New York to come meet with our farmers. They serve restaurants in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and they're interested in specialty crops. And so we're in the process of negotiation about what our smaller farmers can produce for restaurants in a high-value market. Next, we are interested in investment management services. We have met with large investors, a hedge fund, and they would like to loan $20 million. And we think about how in the world do we create business plans for $20 million? And so this is where the idea of an investment management service comes, to break this down and put together the kind of plans not only for farms but also for businesses that can absorb a large sum of money that we can actually pay back. This is a huge challenge. We also have large sawmills in our area, and we have a surplus of sawdust and chips. Some of this is mixed with coal and burned, and all of this has to be shipped away, though. Some of it is used to make paper, some of it's shipped to North Carolina for particle board. And so we've invited investors in to look at biochar, to look at turning this into diesel fuel, and a whole series of other products that are possible. We have a graduate student from Virginia Tech that's exploring non-timber forest products. This would include ginseng, black cohosh, and a series of other crops that aren't exceptional here but are rare in other places. For example, right now we have restaurants in New York that would like ramps from Southwest Virginia. And just to put this together is a challenge. Finally, we are working on developing a nonprofit focused on the development of for-profit companies, because this is the great problem we have, is putting together all these business plans so that we can create the infrastructure we need to participate in contemporary agriculture so we can serve the markets for half the people in the U.S.
Thank you, Jerry and Kelly. We also had one more session that Kim alluded to or mentioned in far southwest Virginia, and they were pulled together a variety of stakeholders, around 80, or between 80 and 100, and there were a lot of folks that were focused on public health as well as some of the other agricultural and food system issues that were represented in the other sessions. So Jerry, Kelly, and Kim and I made up the team of people who analyzed the data. And one of the things that we were looking for based on the objectives we brought into the assessment, into these work sessions, was we were looking for synergies. And so we were looking for 2 or more things that are brought together and produce something that is greater than the sum of the parts. And to be able to have a lens to see synergies like this, we use 2 different frameworks. And so we use the whole measures for community food systems, which came out of the Community Food Security Coalition, which is an evaluation and planning tool that really is focused on how our work aligns with our values. And so they use these different values, justice and fairness, strong communities, healthy people, vibrant farms, thriving local economies, and ecological sustainability. And they put these values forward as kind of representing at least that starting point for thinking about a holistic food system. And then we also use the community capitalist framework, which many of you are probably familiar with, which is an assets-based approach for kind of assessing community wealth. So we were looking at how these assets lined up next to these different values. So what sort of values do we have around, or what sort of assets do we have connected to vibrant farms or strong communities? And so the findings that we have 4 different synergies that we're pulling out, and we use these 4 different synergies to inform the recommendations moving forward. So the first synergy was that there's financial capital around the value of vibrant farms and thriving local economies. So a number of the people that came to these sessions and were involved in the assessment are in some ways connected to these ideas of vibrant farms and thriving local economies. And while there may not be a tremendous amount of financial capital associated with these things, there is relative to some of the other whole measures. So that was a real, I think, a real asset that we have moving forward. And then the synergy B is that there is social capital around vibrant farms. And so this has been a critical asset for moving the work forward to this point, I think, having people that are connected around these ideas of resilient and sustainable food and agricultural systems. And that's kind of been a point that we can often come back to as a place that people can really kind of get together and move things along. Synergy C is a synergy between a synergy around cultural capital and the values of justice and fairness and strong communities. So across these different work sessions, it was clear that people were bringing these cultural values to this work. They weren't engaging in food systems work or community food security work because it was necessarily economically efficient or expedient. There are these ideas of justice and fairness and strong communities, to use the language of the whole measures, that people were bringing to this work that was keeping them pushing for a Southwest Virginia that is more resilient and more food secure. So that was a big piece that really kind of stood out. And then the last synergy was that across the whole measures, across all those values, that there's a lot of human capital. So if we look back at those values, you can see justice and fairness, strong communities, healthy people, vibrant farms, thriving local economies, and ecological sustainability. So there are people working in all of these different fields, and which is a tremendous starting point, or a tremendous place to be, I think. One thing that we and this kind of comes out in the recommendations, is this idea that human capital is often not connected as much as it could be. So it ends up being kind of an underutilized asset that we have sitting all around the region. So as we were trying to make sense of what you could do with these synergies and what you could recommend with them and how we can move this work forward, the idea of complexity was a really useful concept to help us think about that. And so this is a framework from Dave Snowden. It's 4 different scenarios that a leader might, or a decision maker might find themselves in. So 4 different contexts for making decisions, or 4 different contexts of problems. So in the bottom right quadrant, you have simple problems. So these are problems like say your door is squeaky. And so in this case, in a simple problem, you can sense the door squeaking, you can categorize it, it probably needs some oil, and then you can respond, you can oil the hinge. And so for simple problems, there are best practices that you can apply. And the situation of community food security does not fit that criteria. And the second, up in the top right quadrant, is the complicated domain. And in this one, the relationship between cause and effect is a little more nebulous than it is in the simple domain. And so it might be like you're driving down the road and your engine starts knocking, and the only thing I would know to do would be to pull over on the side of the road and call a mechanic. But a mechanic, an expert, might be able to listen to the car and then analyze what was happening and rule out some things and say, I think that this is your problem, and then respond. So in this case, good practices are really appropriate. But in the domain that we see community food security falling into, or food insecurity falling into, is the domain of the complex, which is the top left quadrant. And so in this quadrant, relationship between cause and effect can't be sensed until maybe in retrospect. There are too many things happening and too many complicating factors. And so in this quadrant, all you can do is kind of experiment or probe and then sense or evaluate and then respond. So this is the domain where you really need to focus on having emergent solutions and solutions that emerge from local context. And so this is a really helpful thing to think about, because it really changed the way, at least that I was thinking about, how you might address food insecurity. So how do we create the conditions where emergent practice can occur? And that's kind of was a question that was driving some of the sense making that we applied to these synergies. And so the vehicle that we have kind of used has kind of become the place to move some of this work forward and think about creating these conditions has been the Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network. And Kelli has been really instrumental in moving that work forward. So she's going to talk some about that so you can get a sense of kind of where that work is.
Yeah, thanks again, Phil. As you guys can see from your screen, we've got the mission up there for the Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network, so you can read through that. But what we were thinking about from the very beginning when we started this entire project was, you know, we were starting to talk to different folks in the communities. We started just by talking, and then we went into the key informant interviews, and we learned that there was a lot of great work going on in Southwest Virginia. You heard a little bit about that when we were describing the community work sessions. But who was connecting all of us? You know, where was the sense of the greater we? And how could we begin to hold space and encourage that greater we conversation for all of Southwest Virginia? Also, how could we look at all of that human capital that we have in this region that's unconnected and begin to connect that in some way? So it's really an effort to keep the relationships going that were started at the very beginning of the whole AFP process and have been strengthened throughout the years of work. It's a way to enhance the communication and carry forth and implement the recommendations of the Community Food Security Assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Kelli. So we were thinking about the Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network as we were thinking about moving this work forward. And so these recommendations are kind of aimed at this network, or they are aimed at this network. So recommendation one is that we work on strengthening the existing synergies, as Kelli said, by connecting regional human capital. And so some ideas about what this might look like, we're seeking opportunities and funding for continuing some of the work that have been started with these convenings and gatherings, and particularly with the intent of developing a learning network and building relationships and trust. And then another thing that I think really has risen to the surface across the assessment and across some of the broader work that we've been doing in Central Appalachia with the Foodshed Project is that underutilized human capital. And so thinking about how do we connect human capital and make it more make it more efficient to connect human capital. And so one thing, I mean, this work is so dynamic and changes so quickly, as I think many of you are familiar with. And so we had to think about how do you do it in a way that the connectivity can keep up with that dynamic. And so we've been looking at using a platform like Local Wiki, which is an online, open source, open access platform that is a place where people can put their information, they can map themselves, and they can connect via tags and really take some ownership of knowledge creation and connecting themselves to other organizations across the region. So that's kind of in its infancy stages. And then I think kind of overall, just this working towards a culture of open information sharing and greater information transparency. Recommendation 2 is to develop and strengthen relationships with a broader group of organizations that are committed to building strong communities and justice and fairness. And so I think that this was kind of came out of the idea of that cultural commitment. It's just really, it really drives this work forward. And there are people outside of food systems and agriculture work that also are doing that. And so how can we create the conditions where we can connect and create novel partnerships that might lead to more emergent opportunities and more emergent outcomes? And so how do we, I think this is a question for the network, is how do we develop and sustain places for having dialogue and collaboration with some of the more unlikely partners, maybe people that are working on issues like affordable housing, sustainable jobs, anti-racism, fair wage, access to safe drinking water, and a whole host of other important issues. And the third recommendation, the final recommendation, is to monitor and set up evaluation processes for understanding kind of our progress with those first two recommendations. I think, particularly in the complex domain, I think that this is critical to being able to assess how well you're doing and what needs to change and figure out what needs to move forward. There are a number of resources here, but a couple that have risen to the surface in our work are, again, the whole measures for community food systems as a tool for understanding your values and making sure that what you're doing matches up with your values, as well as some tools like those created by groups like Network Impact that help you assess the strength and health of networks. And so this kind of leads into our future directions, which I think are in a really forming stage. It's kind of, it in itself is emergent. But there are some ideas, I think, that are driving this forward. And one of them is the idea of some theory around networks. And this is taken from that Network Impact document that I referenced just a minute ago. But they say that the promise of networks is threefold, that they can assemble and disassemble capacity with relative ease. They can adapt to emerging opportunities and challenges in their environment. And then they can bring together novel combinations of talent and resources to support innovation. So, I mean, I think you can see how in the complex domain, these are really important pieces that you can come together quickly around ideas and issues as they emerge. And so we've been trying to explore how can this Appalachian Virginia Food Systems Network help create the conditions and the place where that exploration can happen. And so one of the things that's been useful is kind of these different networks. This is taken from a document in 1964, but you can see there are three types of networks. There's the centralized network, where everything goes through a central hub. And then you have a decentralized network, where it's a little more dispersed. And then you have a distributed network, where anybody can connect with anybody at any time. And so while this was, about communication networks in the 1960s, this really applies to what we're able to do now with 21st century technology. And so we can easily, if the information is out there, we can easily find out who's doing what and connect with people in real time and not have to go through brokers to do that. And so we've been thinking a lot about how do we do that? How do we make that happen in Southwest Virginia? And David de Ugarte, who's Spanish, has written this book about networks, and he talks particularly about the distributed network, and he says, within it, decision-making is not binary. It's not a matter of yes or no. It's a matter of to a greater degree or to a lesser degree. So people will jump onto ideas based on how much they resonate with them. So you can throw, if you have the place where ideas can kind of emerge in a place that's really hospitable to new ideas forming, then if you have if you have a pool of people involved, they can cluster around the proposals that make sense. And so the range of action depends on the degree to which the proposal is accepted. So that's a piece that I think we've been exploring as kind of like where we're headed with some of this network stuff. And the devil is definitely in the details, I think, and so we're kind of working that out as we speak. And I have a graphic here that maybe we can come to in the questions, because I think we're kind of pushing over our 30 minutes. So, yeah, I'll scroll through this. So, open up for questions. I guess that's the process, Nikki.
We'd like to open it for questions at this time. There are two ways to interact with the presenters and the information here. One is you can type into your chat box, and I'll help mediate that process. Or if you have an audio connection, if you have a microphone working, you can unmute yourself and chime in to start a discussion. So go for it. And Phil, if you want to, maybe if you want to take a minute to go to those last couple slides while we see if there are any questions.
Sure. So this is a little graphic that we had created as we were trying to think about what does it look like to do a distributed network in the context that we're in Southwest Virginia and Appalachian Virginia. And so this is not a perfect diagram, but it kind of gives you an idea of where our thinking is. So the question of how might this network work? And so we have you or me or whoever, and there you are with a bunch of other people that are connected to this network. And then, ooh, I have an idea. So you throw an idea out. Has anyone else been thinking about? And so this is taking place in probably a digital space like local wiki, or even something as simple as a listserv, depending on the size of the group. And then people are able to chime in and say, yeah, that is interesting. That is a proposal that resonates with me, or an idea that resonates with me. And then thinking about how we as the network and as people thinking about facilitating a network, how we can then provide some support to these emergent issue circles as they emerge. So having a group that we've called it a network facilitator circle, or think, act, tank, I think is another word that's right, Kelly?
Right. We've been talking about pollinator.
Yeah.
As a potential term to describe us.
Yeah, and so we're in the stages of figuring this out and kind of coming up with some processes that we could at least test out in kind of an experimental stage. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of our really rough thinking on that.
Oh, yeah, sorry from Jeff.
Yeah, what is it?
Jeff Feinstreich says, great stuff. Are you thinking about how you might build the capacity of individuals and organizations to act as boundary spanners and knowledge workers? Or other capacity building? Looks like you're answering that partly right now. About capacity building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that we have talked about. So we have used something called dynamic self-governance, or now I think it's called Circle Forward, as kind of a facilitation process. And we've been, I mean, Kelly actually right now, maybe we'll talk about being involved in you're involved in a facilitator circle with that process that you could pull other people into to build some of that.
Right. I just started a new training process with a group of facilitators in Western North Carolina. And so we're going through training just to learn about how can you develop these circles. And the circles can address different levels of issues in the community as they arise. So, again, a way to tackle some of these emergent issues. And sometimes it is the facilitation that you need, or some leadership or someone to lead a meeting, but sometimes you just need someone to serve as a connector or a coupling to grow that group. And just because you're a facilitator in the area doesn't mean that you necessarily have all the answers or you're the lead.
Yeah, but sometimes I think that we have felt like the groups that emerge maybe don't necessarily have someone that really feels right in that facilitator position. So how can we as a network, as kind of one of the things that we would see the network doing is provide that a little bit of support with that.
I think that would definitely be a positive way to link all that human capital that we found that we have in Southwest Virginia. So yeah, I think.
Another way to think about it is sort of mixing framework to some degree, where you have a distributed, I'm going to use the word community, across a larger region, and everyone has their other communities or their other communities of practice. And so how can you link their different systems together? I mean, there will be people who naturally are gravitating towards either leadership roles in those communities of practice. They themselves, like you said, mentioned, Jeff, they are knowledge brokers. What I find interesting and useful about this is how can we continue to share that knowledge broking? It's like, can we build everyone's capacity at different spaces and different times to help do that? At the same time, people are going to gravitate. We want to work together on issues, and so relationships, I think we all agree, are going to be, that's to me the most essential piece of the puzzle, is how do you create new relationships as well as nurture the ones that are already in existence, all at the same time, to address different issues across the region at different spaces. And so I see the role of communities of practice in a more situated perspective, tying very nicely and very importantly into a distributed way people would communicate and continue to gravitate back together, to synergize together. So I definitely see many, many layers of that capacity building needing to take place, which gets back to the complication, but also the necessity of people continue to do that.
This is Jerry Moles. I am a facilitator, and I've worked with Grayson Landcare for 10 years. And what we did is I went in, we got agreement on the triple bottom line, and then the local people have to define what the triple bottom line is. And what you have to do is it has to be beneficial for people to participate. What do they get out of this? If we think about networks that hold even biological things together, even our cells, there are exchanges of information, there are exchanges of energy, and there are exchanges of material things. So as we work with farmers, the distributors of food, all of this, to get them to work together, it has to be to their benefit. And so, fortunately for me as a facilitator, the local community in Grayson County has taken over. And so now I'm working on the kinds of things that I mentioned earlier about how do we create the infrastructure. But I already have active groups, both with Sustained Floyd and Grayson Landcare, who have self-organized with some facilitation support, and we're moving. We have farmers now that are doing experimentation. Riverstone Farms that Woody and Jackie Crenshaw have done. They've invested a lot of money to enter into the market so that their smaller farmer neighbors can join in. We have people in Grayson County who are now selling grass-fed beef directly to New York. And this opens up the market, and we now understand the technology so other farmers can join in. We know how it's to their benefit. We know where the market is. And so it's building, the people build this themselves because it's to their benefit.
Jeff, I hope that answered some of your questions. Feel free to follow up if you have any additional clarification, or if anybody else wants to follow up on that or some other aspect of this. Again, just to situate this, we've, with the Appalachian Foodshed Project, this is the Southwest Virginia Community Food Security Assessment, and we'll be hearing from our West Virginia partners later on probably in May, and then on April 19th, we'll be hearing from John Eshelman on the Western North Carolina assessment. You know, similar, I like to think of the Southwest Virginia assessment as sort of a microcosm of our larger region, and the fact that, you know, we are working across 3 states, and they're very different situations and very different communities, and we have a lot to learn from one another, but it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think here in Southwest Virginia, you know, the learning that's come out of the New River Valley and the conversations that have happened there have helped to inform other conversations across the region, and likewise the conversations that are happening in the BlueRidge Plateau are informing what can be possible in the New River Valley and far Southwest Virginia. So so it's kind of a different approach to an assessment, but I think it's been a very fruitful, I hope, for future work in the region. All right, so if there aren't any further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, if you would like to see this, if you missed part of this webinar, we'll put the slides and a recording up on our website, which is the www.appalachianfoodshedproject.org. You can also find announcements and ways to connect to future webinars and archives of our past webinars, as well as other resources, including the 2 assessments that have been published so far. And feel free to contact Bill, Kim, Kelly, or Jerry if you have any other specific questions about the assessment. So thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you on April 19th at noon for the Western North Carolina Community Food Security Assessment. Thank you.